Before the mall, what was the main shopping area for Newark? And when New Park Mall opens, how are the stores around it affected?
Okay. Um, when Newark incorporated in 1955, Old Town, what today is the Thornton Avenue Business District, was the only shopping center, or the only shopping area in Newark. And immediately there was population pressure, so there was growth that demanded that there would be new additional housing. So you saw small shopping centers begin to spring up around Newark. These are real tiny. For example, the Lewis Center, which is on, I believe, Newark Boulevard today, was one. And the shopping center by the Nimitz Freeway on Thornton Avenue was another. These were developed later, and they pulled the business away from Old Town. So what you saw was Old Town becoming kind of run down, maybe disused, while these new shopping areas drew people from the new housing areas and got most of the business. So I think what happened was the stage was kind of set for New Park because New York didn't really have maybe a plan about what exactly it was going to do to create shopping, to create retail centers. And gradually over time, the idea that New Park would become the big shopping center acquired more and more support. And when it was finally built, you saw a lot of the shopping then move to New Park, especially from Fremont, where stores that were in the hub lost business that went to New Park immediately after it was opened. So that was what, 20 years it took to do that? 1955 to 1980 maybe? And during that time, there were lots of political discussions and lots of arguments about where the shopping would be located. But the one story that kind of goes through the whole thing was that Old Town was losing out, basically lost business to these different shopping centers over time. Now finally, the very last part of the story is that Old Town is beginning to kind of take on a new life. So if you drive down there today, there is, let's see, Carter Station Market, new areas that kind of look better. They're kind of a little bit spiffier. They have, I think, maybe larger clientele than they used to have. And so that now the traffic and the customers are coming back to Old Town. So the story, I think, is complete.
Oh, okay. Um, what was women's role when Newark was first founded, and how has it been changed?
My best example of changing women's roles in Newark was the council. And so you had an all-male council in 1955, and that lasted until Shirley Sisk became the first woman council member. And I'm going to have to check the date on that, but I think mid to late 60s Shirley came in. But that was 10 years in which men largely ran the city and kind of reinforced the male stereotype. But Shirley certainly was one who changed that, and since that time it's been changing ever since. So now, if I'm right, there are I think either two or three women on the current council who continue to change that role and give women a voice in local politics. So it has changed.
Okay. Well, how did the completion of the Newark Community Center change social life in Newark?
How did it change?
The social life of Newark, the community.
Oh, okay. That great question. Since we're sitting here talking about it at the community center, real early after incorporation, Parks and Recreation needed a home, so they were everywhere. So I hear stories that there was a Parks and Recreation department, but they were using, for example, Ardenwood when it was still owned by the Patterson family. They were using any place that they could find space for recreation programs. So, for example, Ardenwood was owned by the Patterson family and had a swimming pool. It was their private pool. And the original director, Mel Nunes, cut a deal with the Patterson family to use the Ardenwood pool for swimming lessons. So the message was real clear. They needed a home for the program. They couldn't keep using dozens of different places around the area. And I think what this gave them was one place to begin to centralize programs. So after that, I think their fame grew dramatically. They offered a large number of programs to an increasingly large audience, and this provided the visibility to do that. So again, it was kind of like starting from nothing and building up a recreation program from scratch, but having a building, a community center, was perhaps the heart of their growth and direction.
Thank you. Let's see. So, what were the major businesses of Newark in the past, and what are they now?
Great question. The businesses of Newark began around industry, and in the 1870s, when the town was actually started, it was a railroad that began the town, and it was railroad industry that really kind of got the town going. So, the town was laid out in 1876 by a railroad company. There was nothing there before they were there. So they built a shop to maintain their equipment, and then they pulled in a car builder that built railroad cars commercial, and the car builder pulled in a foundry, and the foundry pulled in a machine shop, and all these businesses related. The railroad wrapped up at the earthquake in 1906, but the idea that Newark was an industrial town seemed to catch on and keep going. So from 1906 forward, Newark built stoves. The Wedgwood Stove Company was here, and they cast wooden stoves in a foundry close to the railroad tracks. And gradually, as you kind of hit the 20s and the 30s and the 40s, the industry kept growing and kept getting heavier. So chemical companies, for example, there was a brass foundry, the salt company, all became larger examples of industry. But that, kind of like Detroit became the Rust Belt of the United States, big industries didn't last down to the present. And what replaced them, as we all know, was the high-tech industries of Silicon Valley. And I think what's cool is that Newark got into the high-tech game late. Silicon Valley began in Palo Alto, expanded to San Jose and Santa Clara. But Newark kind of, although it was close, it was kind of like enough distance. It was a barrier to having high-tech industry come here until maybe 15, 16, 17 years ago. And then one by one, high-tech industries began to come, establish small plants in Newark. And the small plants got bigger when they built the gateway facility for semiconductor systems. So that's the last generation of industry in Newark, and the one that we live in today.
Okay. And how did Newark change with the completion of the Dumbarton Bridge in 1926?
Let's go back a second to that railroad that built Newark. It was kind of a weird idea. You have to remember that transportation was really slow in the 1870s. So if you worked in San Francisco, you pretty much had to live in San Francisco or along a railroad track that would get you there quickly. So the only railroad was from San Francisco to San Jose. And when this railroad was built, the light bulb went on, and the railroad figured that if it could get people rapidly to a ferry boat in Alameda, they could commute from Newark to San Francisco as easily as you could from Palo Alto. So the idea that Newark was a commute city to San Francisco took hold when the railroad built the town. And when the bridge opened in 1929, it was kind of like a jump in the same direction, because instead of railroads, it would be automobiles, but the bridge made it possible to get to the peninsula very quickly. So I think it reinforced the idea that Newark could become a bedroom community. In the 1870s, it probably had a population of 1,000 people, but in 1929, when the bridge opened, that population began to jump and rise rapidly because of the idea that people could commute to San Francisco from Newark.
Okay. And how much does the history of Newark, such as Ardenwood, affect its inhabitants today, in modern time?
Give me an example. Why did you pick Ardenwood, in other words?
Well, because Ardenwood, they have a lot of, such as Newark Days is another example, where they have the anniversary how does that affect Newark?
So the question would be, how does Newark's history or historical activities affect Newark?
Yes.
Um, it's a good question because the population has changed so much that you have a very different audience here than the one that was here 20 or 30 years ago or more. And I think what makes that particularly interesting is that you have a very large percentage of non-native speaking citizens who have come to the United States or are second generation citizens whose native land may be India or Pakistan or Afghanistan. And so the question in my mind is, how can you give this new population some idea of what the history is here? And I think places like Ardenwood or Newark Days help teach or pass along that culture, that history to new people who have no idea. Good example, I volunteer at Ardenwood, and 2 weeks ago we held the rail event. It's called Rail Fair. It happens once a year. And I have no idea what the impact is of this event on people who haven't grown up here. But the one thing I observed was that there was a wide variety of ethnicities, of cultures that came to that event. And they all seemed to enjoy it. They all seemed to plug in and engage and be interested, which told me that if we show interest and enthusiasm for our culture, we'll find a way to tell others about it. Newcomers who may not have the appreciation some folks do who've stayed here longer or been here longer. So I think they do serve a really important function. And as time goes on, it will become only more important.
Okay. And in your opinion, what makes Newark unique?
That's an easy one. It's another great question. Really like your questions, by the way. For me, it's easy because I think the answer is a strong sense of community. I think it is a town that has pulled together and defined its culture by participating. So you find, for example, volunteerism is not a new idea here. It's been around forever. The idea of helping people, you'll find if you go back 50 years or more, you'll find people like, for example, Viola Blythe, who now has left behind the Viola Blythe Center as kind of a legacy. But it's based on volunteering and on the community supporting other members of the community. My favorite example is the Ash Street Park and the Ash Street neighborhood, which created a neighborhood spirit and kept it and built a community center, almost like a city within a city, but with a strong sense of pride about wanting a community center and wanting a volunteer base there in Ash Street to support its own population. Great example of the spirit, I think, of Newark.
Okay, and that's all the questions I have. All right.
Daniel, great questions. I really appreciate it. My God.
All right. So, okay, so what does your new book encompass that the Centennial History of Newark didn't?
Centennial.
The last.
Right. The first book, Centennial, went up to the incorporation of Newark in 1955. And the new book starts in 1955 and it comes forward, so it goes all the way to 2005.
What originally prompted you to want to write about Newark in the first place?
My family worked here. My dad was working for the school district for years. And so as a kid, I kind of went around and shared stories and met people and kind of absorbed some of the local lore and history and was intrigued by it, especially by the railroads. And so that became kind of a theme or a core to the stories. So that's how it started.